Hello everyone, it's Miss Palmer here, and today's remote learning lesson is going to be looking at the themes of culture and identity, and we're going to be exploring those themes as we revise the poems Checking Out Me History and the Emigree, both from the AQA Power and Conflict Poetry Cluster. Okay, so let's think about those two concepts in slightly greater detail then. Culture and identity. At this moment in time, what does that mean to you? Have a think. What do you know about the term culture? What does that mean? And what do you think of when you think of the word identity? What do they mean for you? Can you think of anything recently in the news that you've heard or on social media about culture and identity? So if we look at culture first, culture is the customary beliefs, social forms, and material traits of a racial, religious, or social group. So a lot of your culture really is influenced by sort of where you live, where you've grown up, the people that you've associated with, perhaps your parents' values and beliefs as well, or the people, your carers. And if you look at this picture here, you'll see that there's lots of different things that can form a culture. So a culture could be shared attitudes, shared beliefs. It might be that you are part of a group who campaign for climate change. That would be part of a culture. The language that you speak, your customs. You might think of some things that are very stereotypically part of British culture. Lots of people from other countries associate food like fish and chips and pie and mash as part of British culture, and you'll see food is on this spiral as well. Faith and religion is also included. Behaviour, British people are known for queuing quite a lot of the time. We do like a queue. Art, drama and music, and rituals as well. Are there any rituals that we perform that perhaps other cultures don't as much? There's in Italy, you'll know, some of you will know if you've been to Italy, that they have specific hand gestures which mean things that other people from other cultures wouldn't actually be aware of. So all of that comes under culture. So you can see that that's really closely linked then to the term identity. So identity is more about an individual than a group of people. So it's who a person is, what makes you the person you are. So it's the qualities, a person or a group, that make them different from others. And the image I've chosen there is one of a finger or thumbprint, because as you'll know, everyone's fingerprint is very unique to them. And actually that is why fingerprints are used by forensic teams to identify individuals, because it's very, very unique. And your identity is unique. What you believe personally, the way you behave, the ideas you might bring to a classroom, all of those things form your identity. And at your age, at sort of 15, 16 years old, you're really sort of at the core of constructing your identity, trying to make sense of who you are. This might be a time in your life where you're perhaps trialing different things, trialing different dress senses, different outfits, to find out who you want to be moving forward in your life. So you can actually combine these two components, and we've got a term known as cultural identity. So cultural identity there is the identity or feeling of belonging to a group. So it's about you belonging to a group because you have that shared culture. And we're going to talk a bit about cultural identity as we look at the poems today. So that brings us to our first point, where you can pause this video and think about some of the bigger questions in relation to this poem. Now, I don't mind if you mind map this, or whether you want to do a piece of free writing, which means that you just write down your thoughts and feelings without sort of worrying too much about grammar, punctuation, paragraphs. It is just about you being really free and getting your thoughts and ideas in relation to these questions down onto the page. So the questions I'd like you to think about are: Do you think your lessons in school teach you about your cultural identity? And to what extent do you think your place of birth influences your cultural identity? I'd like you to pause and even mind map or do some free writing on those questions now. Okay, so hopefully you've done that, and we can move on to look at our first poem, which is Checking Out Me History by John Agard. So to give you a little bit more context to this poem, John Agard was born in 1949 in the former British colony Guyana. Now Guyana, if you have a look at this map, is right at the top of South America there. Okay, so it used to be a British colony. It isn't anymore, but a lot of people in Guyana would speak British, but actually they're so close to the Caribbean that there's a lot of Caribbean culture in Guyana. But John Agard didn't stay in Guyana. He moved to Britain in 1977. He is an award-winning performance poet, which means that his poems really aren't intended just to be read. They are supposed to be performed. And in a moment, I am going to direct you to look at another video where he performs his own poem. And you'll see what I mean. It sounds a little bit more like a song than what we would expect of a poem. So Agard worked as a teacher and a journalist before moving to Britain. And then in Britain, he initially worked for the Commonwealth Institute as a touring lecturer, giving talks and readings, promoting greater understanding of Caribbean culture. Now, I've got another thinking point that I would like you to pause on at the moment. And that thinking point is to think about this question: what challenges do you think John Agard would have faced moving from Guyana to Britain? So really think about culture and actually how much you have to sort of adjust your identity when you move into a place with a very different culture. How would you feel if you were moving over the other side of the world into a country which has a very different culture? And what challenges do you think you would come up against? So now is the time again where you can pause and either mind map or free write some of your ideas. Okay, so as I said, I was going to direct you to another video on YouTube. So if you're not already watching this video on YouTube and you're watching through Microsoft Teams or from Show My Homework, then I suggest you go over to YouTube now, type in Checking Out Me History into the search bar, and the first video that comes up by BBC Teach is the video of John Agard performing his poem. And before that, he gives a little bit of background to the poem and he describes the process of writing his poem, Checking Out Me History. It is very much a criticism of the UK curriculum and what we teach, and the fact that actually the UK curriculum is based on predominantly white figures in history. And he believed that actually for those people who were black, people of colour, this sort of shielded them from their own identity and their own culture. So if you can go over to YouTube and have a look at that video now before we move on to look at the language together. In a moment, I'd like you to pause this video and either copy down the 3 easier quotes to remember or the 3 slightly more challenging quotations. Obviously, those challenging quotations do offer greater scope for analysis, but they might be quite hard for you to remember. So you've got to think about what do you think you're capable of memorising to take in with you for that exam. So I'll look at or talk to you a little bit about those easier quotes first of all. So that first one, dem tell me, I want you to think about the use of dialect there, dem rather than them. Why do you think John Agard has done that? Also the fact that they are 3 monosyllabic words. They have 1 syllable. Why do you think that is right in the opening of this poem? What sort of tone does that create from the onset? The second quotation there, Blind me to me own identity. We've got the continuation of the use of dialect there. It's not really a syntax, so a word order that we would use as we speak sort of standard English. We've got a metaphor that you can analyse at the start. Blind me to me own identity. No one's actually blinding him. They're not taking out his eyes. It is a metaphor. Okay, think about why has he used that? It sounds very severe, doesn't it, to blind somebody? Why does he want it to sound that severe? And then the repetition of identity. Why is that so important? The final one there is taken from the end of the poem. I carving out me identity. Again, this is a really interesting verb to use within the metaphor. Why is it carving? Why is it not I'm creating, for example? Think about the process of actually carving something, and what does that tell us about the way he is reclaiming and forming his identity now? If we move over to those more challenging quotations, there's nothing stopping you, by the way, from doing both of these. I'll look at the first one. So we've got the sort of extended version of the second quotation in the easier quotes. Bandage me eye with me own identity and blind me to me own identity. Sorry, I read that wrong. Bandage me eye with me own history and blind me to me own identity. So again, think about that actual process of to bandage somebody's eye. What is it saying? What sort of imagery does that conjure for you? What do you imagine? And why is he using it in that context? Later on, when he talks about Nanny de Maroon, he refers to her as Fire Woman in the second quotation. Fire Woman, struggle, hopeful stream to freedom, river. Really interesting to look at this line. Fire woman is obviously another metaphor. Why has he created fire as an adjective? What is he saying about this woman? Struggle, hopeful is almost an oxymoron. So think about what is going on there. And why does stream become river? What is he referring to? And you might need to pause here and do a little bit of research about Nanny de Maroon as well to help you analyse this quotation. And then finally, you've got Toussaint, a slave with a vision. Now, I think this is really interesting when you look at the word vision and comparing it to some of the other metaphors within the poem that we've spoken about already, where he says, blind me and bandage me eye. So he's talking, of course, about people within the UK blinding him, bandaging his eye. But what's he saying about this slave with a vision? What is he actually saying about Toussaint? And again, you might want to pause and research a little bit about Toussaint and Napoleon to be able to analyse this quotation in detail. When you bring in those sort of research factors about the actual historical figures, that's when you start covering assessment objective 3, which is making relevant links in your analysis to social and historical context. So it's really worth taking the time to do that. Okay, if you'd like to pause now, copy out the quotes and get as much analysis as you can out of them. I always say to my students, squeeze the quotations, get everything you can out of it before you move on. Right, moving on to structure and form. So the way the poem is set out, the way the poem looks on the page. And to be able to do this, and so you know what I'm talking about, I've put a copy of the poem on the left-hand side of the screen there. And you'll see that there is the repetition of dem tell me at the start and end of the poem. Now, I asked you, if you were doing the easier quotations on the last slide, to look and think about why dem tell me is monosyllabic, 3 monosyllabic words. I think it creates a really accusatory tone there. This is aimed at them. This is a poem which is trying to make you think differently about what is taught in UK schools. And this is really, really key at the moment with the Black Lives Matter movement, the fact that actually we need to have more diversity within our curriculum because it is focused predominantly on white history. So he starts off with a really sort of bitter accusatory tone because he wants change, and he comes back to that bitter accusatory tone at the end of the poem again because he wants change. Throughout the poem though, he alternates between two different structures. And if you watch the the video of John Agard actually performing this poem, you'll see he changes his tone quite dramatically between these two structures. So the first structure is mostly written in quatrains, so 4 lines with rhyming couplets at the end. So we've got, for example, "Dem tell me about 1066 and all that. Dem tell me about Dick Whittington and he cat." Dat and cat is a rhyming couplet. It's meant to have quite a sing-song sort of feel and a jolly upbeat feel to those lines. It's as if when he tells about those stories that are taught in UK schools, it's all like it doesn't really matter too much. It's interesting he's spoken about Dick Whittington there, because Dick Whittington became sort of a folk tale within the UK, and he juxtaposes it by, at the end of the quatrain, mentioning Toussaint Louverture, who he goes on to talk about in the next stanza in more detail. And the juxtaposition there between a folk tale and somebody who should really be a very celebrated, iconic figure in history shows that he thinks what was taught to him was not important and what wasn't taught to him was really important. So that brings me on to talk about the next structure that he alternates between. So the next structure has much longer stanzas with shorter lines. So if we look at the start of for example, of the next stanza within that structure, it starts with Toussaint, a slave with vision, lick back, Napoleon, battalion. You'll see that those sort of short 1 or 2 word lines are meant to be read in a far more serious tone. They're supposed to have impact there, a little bit like the monosyllabic words "dem tell me" at the start. He's getting serious now. He really wants you to listen to this because these are the iconic black figures in history he thinks have been left out of the curriculum, who really need to be celebrated. And what his overall message is there is that by leaving those out of the curriculum, you are hiding or sort of holding people of colour and black people back from experiencing and learning about their own culture and their own identity. And obviously in the UK we are supposed to be culturally diverse, but what he's saying is that what we teach in schools doesn't match up with that. We are not culturally diverse in terms of what we teach in school, which is why we've got these really serious, hard-hitting stanzas in between. And then the final point about structure that I'm going to make here is right at the end when he switches the subject of the sentence. So I told you earlier that it's about, there is a cyclical structure within this poem. However, at the start, he says, "Dem tell me." The subject of that sentence is dem, so them, the people teaching in the UK and the people who make the decisions about the curriculum in the UK. What it comes back to though in the final 2 lines is there's a switch there. So the subject of the sentence switches from the plural or the collective pronoun them to the singular pronoun I, showing that he is actually taking back control. He's taking the power by the end. He says, "I checking out me own history, I carving out me identity." So the switch from them to I at being the subject of the sentence shows that he is reclaiming his identity. Okay, so then we move on to our next poem. The next poem in the power and conflict cluster to look at is the Emigree. So to give you some context for this, Carol Rumans, the poet, grew up in the culturally diverse south of London, which is also where she was born. So although this poem is about somebody who has moved from their home country to another country, it is not an autobiographical poem. It's not an experience that she had herself. So she's imagining what it must be like. And actually, what she's doing is looking at the memories we held as children and how perhaps they're quite innocent. So if you have moved from your home country to another country, you might sort of hold quite a naive view of your country, because an emigre is somebody who's usually had to move because of social or political reasons. So it might be that they're seeking asylum and that their home country is actually too dangerous for them to live in. It could now be a war zone, for example. In this poem, she describes the country being sick with tyrants. So we know that actually it probably is a very dangerous place, but the speaker in the poem tells of her home country in a very positive light. She keeps referring to sunlight, showing that as children we have this sort of naive and positive view of the world, and we perhaps are not aware of what is actually happening that's really quite damaging and dangerous. So the Emigree was published in 1993 in a collection of poems entitled Thinking of Skins. So again, this is about identity and it's about culture as well. And in the early 1990s, when this poem was written, in the UK, immigration overtook the natural population increase, which is births minus deaths, for the first time. And obviously with Carol Rumans growing up in the south of London, she would have been sort of coming into contact with and speaking to people who had moved from other countries to live in the UK. So it would be based on those sort of second-hand stories. So again, you can pause here and start to put some of your own ideas together. Why do you think Carol Rumans wrote this poem, considering she was not an immigrant herself? Again, you can mind map or free write your ideas now. Okay, I'm going to direct you again to log on to YouTube in a moment and type into the search bar the Emigree reading. The first one that comes up at the time of me recording this is a poetry reading of the Emigree by Carol Rumans, English GCSE Power and Conflict, and it's 1 minute and 52 seconds long. I recommend this one. I think it's read particularly well, but also because you have got the text of the poem there for you to read along with it as well. So it's a really good way to remind yourself of the poem because you can see it as well as hear it. So if you can pause now and go over to YouTube and just watch that to refresh your memory, to think about what the poem was about overall. Okay. So now we come to look at the language again. Once again, I've divided up the page so that you've got the choice of either the easier quotes to remember, and there's 3 quotes there, or the more challenging quotes. I'm going to give you some tips before you do that. So if you're doing the easier quotes, then we start with the opening line. There was once a country. Think about what this sounds like. What sort of story does it sound like it's leading into? There was once. Do you recognise that as a convention of a story opening? And why might she have chosen to open the story this way? Remember I said about how there's something to do with the innocence of the childhood mind and your memories of a child being quite naive. So link that to the story convention opening here. Now, the second one is I am branded by an impression of sunlight. Really interesting metaphor with the choice of verb branded. What does that actually mean? And could it link to identity, perhaps? What is the link there between the verb branded and identity? and an impression of sunlight. Why doesn't she just say, I am branded by sunlight? It's still a metaphor. Why is it important that we've got an impression there? What could that suggest? And then finally, why does she use this metaphor of it being sunlight? So what is the sunlight? What has she been branded by her memories of her home country? And then the final quote there in the easier quotes to remember is, they accuse me of being dark in their free country. Now it's really ambiguous with that use of the pronoun at the start, they. Who is she referring to here? Look at it in context in the poem. You might have to go back to the YouTube video where you had the text of the poem alongside it so you can put it back into context. But it's in the final stanza. She says, they accuse me of being dark in their free country. Who is she talking about? And what is she suggesting about where she's moved to? Or in their free city, sorry, I said country there. And then on the more challenging quotations, you've got, it may be at war, it may be sick with tyrants. Now she's actually personifying her country there, and she does this a few times in the poem. So she's suggesting it's sick. What does that actually suggest in reality about her country? Why sick? What does that mean? Is sick a permanent thing? It can be. Or do you think it's something that's perhaps temporary, or she hopes is temporary? And with tyrants, a tyrant is somebody who is a very controlling, oppressive ruler. So what does that mean, to be sick with tyrants? She then says, again, she's talking about her country here, so she's creating this metaphor. She says, I comb its hair and love its shining eyes. Interesting to think about the imagery created here. What do you imagine that she's doing there, and why is she referring to her country this way? If you think about that link with children, what would children why would they do that? What would they do it to? So they comb what's hair? What do they do with shining eyes? What is she actually referring to and making the connection with there? And then finally, they accuse me of absence, they circle me, they accuse me of being dark in their free city. So that's obviously the extended version of the final quote in the easier quotes to remember. So they accuse me of absence, they circle me. And I want you to think about whether they in the first line, where she says they accuse me, is the same they as in the second time she says they accuse me. Is she talking about the same collective group of people, or could potentially she be talking about two different groups of people using the same pronoun? So I want you to pause now and choose either to copy out and annotate the easier quotes, or copy out and annotate the more challenging quotes. Remember, as I said before, try and get as much analysis out of this as you can. You want to use subject terminology. That's part of assessment objective 2. So I've spoken to you already about verb choices, about metaphors, about personification. So all of those terms you want to use in your analysis as you annotate, but really what's fundamental is that you actually get down the effect of it and you start to explore interpretations. So from those terms where you've written metaphor, try and get at least 2 different branches off of that in your annotations of 2 different interpretations. Okay, so then we move on to structure and form. So once again, I've got the copy of the poem down the side so you can see what it looks like on the page. You'll see that it is in 3 stanzas. It's a first person account of the speaker's relationship with their home country. We see in the first line she uses the personal pronoun I left it as a child. So it's first person account there. The country is left unnamed, which could suggest this is more of a commentary on how people feel about their place of birth, rather than just being a literal story about one person who moved away from their home country. It could be a wider commentary about how people feel about where they come from, perhaps because of how important that is in shaping their identity, going back to that main theme that we're looking at throughout this lesson. There are long lines here, so 3 stanzas, all of a similar length, as I will go through in a moment, but there's not a lot of variation in the line lengths. They're all fairly long, and they can contain multiple clauses, so we see a lot of punctuation throughout. This makes it look a little bit more like prose on the page. So it looks like a story rather than a poem, which would fit obviously with that opening where it says there was once a country. So it seems as though she has purposely written this to look like prose rather than to look like a poem. And then the first 2 stanzas are made up of 8 lines. However, the final stanza has 9 lines, and the reason for that isn't actually very clear at all. So it's left open to interpretation. So again, if something is ambiguous, if it's left open to interpretation, you can put forward more than one interpretation. You say, she could have included a final line because. However, it may also be the case that she included the final line because. Okay, you could talk about this idea of perhaps growth, having to add another layer to her identity as she moved away from her home country. All of those would be valid interpretations. So as we come to the end of this remote learning lesson, I'd like to leave you with some big questions that you can either write sort of some free writing after or just discuss with the people at home. Perhaps you've been revising this with somebody else. If you're using Microsoft Teams, you could discuss these big questions with your team on there, with your classmates. Use the forum there to discuss the big questions and to perhaps debate some of these ideas. So the first one is, do you think the national curriculum in the UK should change to teach about a diverse range of cultures? How diverse do you personally think our curriculum is? You're in the school system at the moment. Okay, do you think it's diverse enough, or do you think it needs to change? Number 2. How much of your identity is dependent on where you live or where you grow up? Number 3, what key moments of experiences in your past have helped form your identity and make you the person you are today? Is there anything that really stands out, an experience where you think, actually, I changed as a person after that, or I wanted to change as a person after that? So that's a real reflective one for you to think about your own personal identity at the end there. And that's one perhaps you may not wish to discuss on an open forum, but it would be interesting to debate the first 2 questions, as I'm sure you have lots of different ideas. As long as we're respectful of each other's opinions, then I think there's some really good discussions to be had. I hope you found this revision lesson helpful, and please do email me or email your English teacher if you have any questions at all about the content we've covered today. Thank you.